Good morning and welcome. This is the Sunday morning sermon for June the 9th of 2024. We're beginning a new series of messages that'll take us basically through the summer. It's a study in the life of Moses. And we're beginning, of course, in the book of Exodus. We're going to follow through chapter 1 and into as far as verse 10 of chapter 2 this morning as we look at passing on a heritage of faith. As we begin this series on the life of Moses, for many of the older generation, the mere mention of Moses brings to mind thoughts of Charlton Heston, as he played the lead role in Cecil B. DeVille's production, The Ten Commandments. In that motion picture, Moses was portrayed as strong, handsome, and wise. For today's generation, if you mention Moses, their thoughts are likely tied to the depiction in the Walt Disney's production, The Prince of Egypt, an entertaining animated production of the life of Moses where he's pictured as athletic, very quick, and very witty and fun-loving. As you look at the biblical record, however, we discover that neither of those depictions are accurate. That Moses was a real man with real struggles, some of which, well, he just didn't handle very well. It's a story of a man who, in spite of his shortcomings, God was still able to use him. You'll remember that from the life of Joseph, that because of a severe famine, Jacob and his sons and their families came to Egypt, where Joseph provided for their needs. When they arrived in Egypt, they were told in the beginning of chapter 1, in verse 5, it says there, all those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. For Jacob was in Egypt, or for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. From a very small band of about 70 people, this family had grown to become a mighty nation, swelling in numbers to perhaps in excess of 2 million people at one point. The new Pharaoh had begun to perceive the Israelites as being a threat, and he feared the numerical strength of the Israelites and began to look for a way to diminish their growing numbers. He feared that they would become allies with their enemies and would overcome them and leave Egypt. Interestingly, everything that Pharaoh feared came to pass in spite of his best efforts. Pharaoh's first plan was to ensure the Israelites, to enslave the Israelites and tighten his grip on them, on Egypt's control over them. A large part of the plan involved intimidation and oppression that was designed to demoralize the Israelites so that they would not have the strength to resist. Pharaoh utilized the large slave labor force to strengthen his own country. But it seems the more they were oppressed, the more that the Israelites multiplied and spread. In verse 12 we read, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. The Egyptian response to the continued numerical growth of the Israelites was to increase the workload and intensify the harassment and cruelty imposed upon them by their taskmasters. Frustrated by the ineffectiveness of the previous attempts to curtail the rapid growth of the Israelites, concern was now turning to panic. And Pharaoh now turns to the Hebrew midwives, and he tells them in verse 15, "Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. And he said to them, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." Pharaoh said, when a baby is born among the Hebrews, if it's a girl, you let that girl live. But if it's a boy, you see to it that he dies. According to the instructions, they were to watch closely as each Hebrew child was born. And if it was a boy, they were to snuff out its life before its first cry was heard. Then the midwife would say to the mother, I'm very sorry, but your child did not live. It's a hideous idea, but in fact, Pharaoh's plans came to nothing. For we read in verse 17 where it says, "But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew mightily. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. These daring women lived out their faith where God had placed them. What they did was daring, but not dramatic. It revealed a faith that would not disobey God. I'm not sure what the phrase "he provided households for them" really means. It may mean that these women found husbands and married and had homes and families of their own. But whatever the specifics, it suggests that these women were protected and rewarded by God. It's interesting to consider we do not today know the name of the Pharaoh who gave that order, but we do know the name of the two Hebrew midwives who saved the male children born in those days. Finally, in complete desperation, Pharaoh commands that all the male children be destroyed, as is revealed in verse 22. It says there, so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. What Pharaoh had previously tried to do underhandedly, he now demanded openly. Having established the circumstances of Moses' birth, I want to continue and examine how his parents passed on a heritage of faith to their son. I want to share with you two principles about faith that we see in this passage of Scripture, and one application about passing on a heritage of faith. So the two principles about faith are this. First of all, faith does not demand that we act foolishly. Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 says, "A man of the house of Levi went and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months." In this terrible time, a child is born to a godly couple of the tribe of Levi. When the parents looked at this newborn child, they saw that just how beautiful this child was. Rather than believe that his parents were impressed merely by the physical beauty of the baby, I believe it better to understand that his parents were convinced that God had a special purpose for this child. The biblical perspective is that children are from God. Psalm 127, verse 3 and following tells us, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are children of one's youth." And the psalmist later in Psalm 139, verses 13 and 14 declares that every child is a product of divine creation. "For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made," the psalmist says. "Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well." We have perhaps often seen depictions of the fear of Moses' parents upon the birth of Moses. Such may be true of other Hebrew parents, but I don't think that was true of Moses' parents, Amram and Jochebed. In fact, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 lets us in on a little secret of how the parents of Moses faced this crisis. We're told by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. This verse from Hebrews 11 indicates that Moses' parents had a deep and abiding faith in God. This verse says that they hid their child because they were not afraid of the king's command. You would expect it to say that they hid their child because they were afraid. And to understand this, we need to remember that there are two threats that the king has made. One against the babies and one against the parents. If you kill your baby, you will live. If you don't kill your baby, you risk your own life. In other words, they looked at the threat against their own lives and said, "We will not give in." The point is that it is faith that produced this courage in them to defy the king. May I suggest to you that Moses grew to be a great man of faith because his father and his mother were great people of faith. How would you like to try to hide a newborn baby for 3 months? I remember well when we brought our babies home from the hospital. Those first 6 weeks, they cried and they cried, and we weren't sure what was wrong with them most of the time, and we could not have concealed them for 3 days, let alone 3 months. And yes, there were times when maybe we would have gladly floated them down the Nile. No, not really. But while doing so, caused them to risk their lives. Moses' parents did hide him for 3 months. Chuck Swindoll says, "To walk by faith does not mean that we stop thinking." How do you apply this to today? I think in situations like this, God expects us to use the brains that he gave us. Continuing on in Swindoll's quote here, he says, to walk by faith does not mean that we stop thinking. To trust God does not imply becoming lazy or apathetic. What a distortion of biblical faith. You and I need to trust God for our finances, but that is not a license to spend foolishly. You and I ought to trust God for our safety in the car, but we're not wise to pass on a blind curve. We trust God for our health, but that doesn't mean that we can chain smoke and stay up half the night and exist on potato chips and Twinkies without consequences. Faith and careful planning go hand in hand, he says. They always have. Number 2 here, faith does not mean that we do not have a plan. Exodus chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, it says, but when she could no longer hide him, she built an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with pitch, and put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. You may be like myself, as I envisioned Jochebed making her way down to the river and placing the basket in the current of the river, and the basket bobbing down the river until it comes to rest in the reeds where it would be found by someone. That's not what happened. Verse 3 says that she laid it in the reeds by the riverbank. In other words, she carefully positioned that little basket precisely where she wanted it. She put the basket in the place where she knew the princess would come to the water's edge. Then she sent Moses' older sister, Miriam, to watch. She had no doubt instructed Miriam carefully on what she was to say when someone found that little basket with the baby in it. In verse 5, we're told, then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked alongside the river. And when she saw the ark moving in the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse your child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. The plan went flawlessly. The princess found the baby just as it was planned, and now I want us to consider the application of passing on a heritage of faith. Passing on a heritage of faith doesn't happen by accident. Verse 9 continues the story with these words. It says, then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. The princess, without realizing it, hires the baby's own mother to nurse and raise Moses. Jochebed had not just got her child back, she got the protection of Pharaoh's daughter, and she was getting paid to raise him. That can't be anything but the hand of God at work. Jochebed had Moses under her care until he was weaned, and while he was growing as a young child. However long that might have been, it was long enough for the mother of Moses to firmly lay a foundation of belief in God. Over 7 million North Americans will have a life-changing experience this year. They will give birth to a child. And how they raise those children will have a greater impact on our society than anything else they do in life. What would you do if you knew that everything that your child might know about God, they would learn from you? What if this was compounded by the knowledge that in all likelihood you would not have very much time to accomplish this? What would you do? What would you tell your child about? The words of Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 7 would take on special meaning, I'm sure. It says there, "You shall teach them diligently to your child the laws of God, and shall talk of them when you sit down in your house, or when you walk by the way, or when you lay down and when you rise up." You would look for opportunities to tell them about your faith. Isn't that what we should be doing anyway? How do you pass on your faith to your children? The words of Proverbs 22 verse 6 offer some instruction here where it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." But what do those words mean? The first word in that verse is the word train, and it comes from a Hebrew word used to describe the actions of a midwife. After she helped deliver a child, she would dip her finger in crushed dates and reach into the mouth of the infant and massage the gums. The flavor sensation of the dates would create in the infant a desire to nurse. So the term train literally means to create a thirst in. Really, that's what school teachers do. They create a thirst in their students for education. And in the brief time that Jochebed had with Moses, she created in him a desire for the things of God that he never got over in life. Nobody takes the place of a preschooler's mother. No one. Parents, the best thing you can do, the best thing you can give your children in life is not possessions or even education, but faith. A faith that leads them to thirst to use their God-given gifts and abilities to accomplish God's purposes in their lives. Next time we get together, we're going to look at number 2 in this series, entitled Getting Ahead of God, where we're going to look at chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Until then, till we meet again, let's continue to exchange prayers daily.